From NBC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press with Tim Russert.
Our issues this Sunday. Tim Russert started every edition of Meet the Press with those four words. And those were the words that he was preparing to record when he collapsed and died on Friday at these NBC studios in Washington. Now his moderator's chair is empty. His voice has been stilled. And our issue this sad Sunday morning is remembering and honoring our colleague and our friend with some of the men and women who worked with him and appeared here on Meet the Press, who knew him best and loved him most. I'm Tom Brokaw. There are so many stories that we could tell about Tim, so many moments that shaped and defined him and our nation. But in this hour that Tim occupied so proudly and did so well, we will focus on the remarkable things that he did right here on Meet the Press, a program that he called a national treasure, of which he said he was only the temporary custodian. For 17 years, of course, he was so much more than all that. His great friend, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, is with us this morning. And it seems to me, Doris, that in the future, historians will have a rich archive in the Meet the Press recordings of the people that passed through these studios, who they were, how they evolved, and what they became.
No question about that. I mean, think about the 19th century. We had diaries, we had letters. That's what allows historians to recreate those people who lived then. In this broadcast world, what these recordings will show people years from now is not just the questions he asked, not even just the answers he got, but which people were able to acknowledge errors, which people ruffled under his questions, which ones could share a laugh. You'll get the temperament of these people. They're going to come alive. You know, he loved that Meet the Press minute at the end where the history would come back. And I keep imagining that maybe 4 or 5 election cycles from now, when we're in our 80s, we'll be dragged back to a bunch of young journalists, and they will say to us, "You knew Tim Russert, you were there with him," and we'll be able to know that we knew this man with his boyish enthusiasm. That's what the records won't show, but we'll know that.
What we should hope when we get into our 80s, however, is that they will not bring back some of the judgments that we made here on Meet the Press.
Right. Sanitize that.
Tim has a very large wooden sign in his office, and it's going to be our mantra for this morning. It says, "Thou shalt not whine." And if I could add, I think anything to that, thou shalt not weep or cry this morning. This is a celebration, a time to remember. And if there was a signature for Meet the Press under the guidance of Tim Russert, the questions were tough but always fair. Let's take a look at some of those questions, tough and fair, over the years here on Meet the Press, and then talk about them.
If I told you it was 25% of your state lived below the poverty line, would you believe me?
I could believe you, yes,
Are
sir.
these the kinds of things the governor should know? Who the largest employers are? How many people live below the poverty line? You said that part of your $40 billion deficit
I have also told your program
is $180 billion.
Yes, may I finish?
May I finish? It was a simple question.
Well, you've already finished.
Well,
Go and finish again. It's your
please.
your program. You can do anything you want to with it.
Will you allow North Korea to build a nuclear bomb?
North Korea cannot be allowed to develop a nuclear bomb. We have to be very firm about it.
Filegate, Travelgate, Whitewater. What's wrong with those as legitimate issues?
Look at all this Whitewater stuff. What's come out of it? Absolutely nothing.
Would you be willing to retract or apologize for some of the things you said?
If I can defend every word that I speak, and every word that I speak is truth, then I have nothing to apologize for.
In light of not finding the weapons of mass destruction, do you believe the war in Iraq is a war of choice or a war of necessity?
I think that's an interesting question. Please elaborate on that a little bit. A war of choice or a war of necessity? I mean, it's a war of necessity.
Mr. Secretary, you say pre-stage people were sent to the convention center. There was no water, no food, no beds, no authorities there. There was no planning.
We'll have time to go back and do an after-action report, but the time right now is to look at what the enormous tasks ahead are.
Many Americans believe now is the time for accountability.
Look, I was asked, I shouldn't have said that. So I've been in public life 25 years. You're going to find a lot of these. It seems you found them all here.
Well, I'm just trying to set the record and trying to give you a chance to respond, which is fair. Senator John McCain, thanks for joining us and sharing your views.
I haven't had so much fun since my last interrogation.
Joining us this morning, among others, from Sun Valley, Idaho, Tim's very dear friend, Maria Shriver, our former colleague. And Maria, I remember so well when you and Tim went to Cuba and you were interviewing Fidel Castro. It was kind of comforting, my guess is, to have Tim at your side on that occasion.
Well, I think it's so poignant that we're talking about Tim on Father's Day because he was a father to so many of us, the whole bureau there and all the young journalists. And when I went to Cuba, he told me ahead of time, you need me in Cuba when you're going to interview Fidel Castro. I said, no, Tim, you don't have to come. I don't really need you. I can handle this myself. He said, no, you need me. I need to produce for you. I need to cheer you up. I need to be there for you. He actually wanted to just meet Castro and he wanted to go along for the ride. But he prepared probably better than I did for the interview, and I remember how excited he was to be there, the intrigue, getting up in the middle of the night, going over to meet Castro, and making sure that I knew everything I needed to ask him. And I think he was that kind of person, as we've talked about, and I think as everybody's talked about, thorough, excited, a lover of history, as Doris said. So he wanted to meet Castro. He wanted to understand the Cuban Missile Crisis. He wanted to get answers. And he probably knew as much about it as Castro himself. But he was great fun. He was a great companion. And really, he saw himself as a mentor to me, and I think to so many others, and I think that's why he was so beloved in our organization and out.
Betsy Fisher, you've been Tim's producer and at his side for a long time. You began here as an intern.
17 years ago.
17 years ago. Tim always said that Big Russ watching in Buffalo was his best barometer. He knew who the phonies were.
He had his own focus group.
Right, and Tim would get that reading at the end of a broadcast. He'd call Big Russ and see how it went.
He would, and he called it the cheapest, most accurate focus group. And that was his needle, his compass. And the next thing he would do is grab me and say, oh, what do we have for next week? What's the show? But James talking about preparation and candidates being prepared coming on here, there was nobody more prepared than Tim Russert himself when people would come on the show. And he would spend, and he called it a luxury, he would spend all week preparing for this show, reading everything. He never once sat in that chair unprepared. He would prepare for a 3-hour show.
I always thought that both his Jesuit training and his legal education, which a lot of people didn't have a full appreciation of, were so important to him because this broadcast was always about accountability. If you're in the public arena and running for office, then we have an obligation to hold you accountable.
Absolutely, and the way he would structure the questions was very lawyerly. He always knew how a candidate was going to respond, and he was prepared enough to know that, and he would sketch it out in his mind. I'm going to ask A, that'll get us to B, that'll get us around to C, and then there's D. And he knew how to get you into that cycle, and he was very skilled at that.
Tim's very good friend Mike Barnacle, my pal as well. Mike and I have talked about this a lot. Tim had that question was not just idle speculation. He wanted to land on the front page of the newspaper the next morning. That was one of the tests that he had here. Meet the Press was successful if they drove the news cycle.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And off of what Betsy and everyone else has said, there's no way people could really comprehend the depth of planning and preparation that Tim would put into this program. And I can tell you, old pal, from the heart that I can certainly comply with one half of your request. I won't whine, but I can't commit at the end of this program to not crying, because we sit here on this set with this in the backdrop, and as Luke Russert told me yesterday, that this program was Tim's second son. Mm-hmm. And he loved this program. He loved it as a vehicle, an educational vehicle for everyone out there, for people in the news business as well as everyone who views this program. And we will all continue, but it will just never, ever be the same, although I will hear his laugh forever.
And this is wild, which was another favorite comment that he would say at the end of a broadcast, or this is big. He would come here early in the morning, earlier than anybody else who ever prepared for these broadcasts, like 6:30, right, Betsy?
Oh, yeah.
And he would rehearse the questions. I mean, he would read them out and look to the camera and do them and anticipate as
play both sides.
Right.
Yeah, well, he had that. He would have made a great prosecutor. And in a sense, sometimes, although always quite fairly, as James pointed out, He was a prosecutor on behalf of the public good here. He was going to get to the news. He was going to get to the story. He was going to get to the truth. And he knew how to do it skillfully and fairly and never condescendingly. And there was always attached to Timmy on this program and in his conversation with public people especially, a Columbo element. You'd be just walking away thinking, I skated on that one. You know, say, Mr. Brokaw, just one more question.
You say, before you go.
Yeah. and
Tom, can I add that also this studio, I thought of it as the church of Tim. He was also the great Uber priest. I would actually get a pass from my own pastor not to go to church on Sundays if I was going to be on Meet the Press. He got that.